She'd been sleeping outside his door for 3 weeks, but last night she left something that made his chest ache. Jack found the line in his head before he could help it, a small, stubborn sentence that tasted like metal and rain. He'd been living with the kind of quiet that sits heavy in the chest. The polite, almost polite kind you keep for other people. He worked nights at the diner and came home to an apartment that smelled like coffee and the newspaper he never opened. He was good at small talk, bad at calls his mother left but never meant to bother with. He was the kind of man who let a Sunday go by without calling anyone and pretended it was restful. But lately, the quiet had been a thickness, a humidity. It made small things feel like impossible tasks. He put his cup in the sink and left it there until morning. He left the porch light off because deciding which socket to flick felt like an equation. On the third night, when the September air had a snap to it, and the first leaves had begun to curl gold at the edges, Jack opened his door to the sound of a small rustle and the faint betrayal of a tiny body shifting on cold concrete. The movement made him think at first of a tangle of newspaper, until he saw the shape, hunched and too thin, ears pressed back the way an overcautious animal does when it's taught to be small. She was a smear of color in the dim hallway, a sickly ginger with mud-smeared fur, a scab on the cheek like someone had tried to peel the world off her. She watched him with eyes the color of pennies left in the sun, wary, bright, and old in a way that had nothing to do with years. Small breaths, a pattern of breath, like the rhythm of someone trying to count the world into order. No mewing at first. Just that look, the way she held her head as if to say, "I see you." He almost backed inside. He'd been told for years now that he had a soft face, and in some half-ashamed way he knew it. People told him when he filled their coffee and they lingered a hair too long. But he was not, in his better judgment, the sort to invite animal trouble into his life. He had rent and bills and a mother who preferred he keep a steady, uncomplicated existence. He had the habit of letting things be. He left the door open a crack because being the person who watched something die in the lot behind his building felt worse than a complaint from his mother. He stood in the doorway, one foot in his apartment, the other anchored to the porch, as if that would keep both worlds from collapsing into each other. The kitten didn't move, except to shift her eyes, a single measured blink. It was a small, almost human gesture, the slow blink of trust cats sometimes give. It made something in him loosen. Jack stepped out. His hands were still warm from dishwater. He crouched, and it was the wrong thing to do if you wanted to be safe, because when you crouch, small animals mistake you for prey or for a new, strange terrain. The kitten tilted her head, assessing, and that was the first real thing that happened. She did not flee. Instead, she inched nearer, the pads of her paws whispering on concrete. Up close, the smell hit. The sharp, sour tang of neglect, mixed with the sweetness of kitten. Her fur stuck in clumps. One eye had a bit of goop gathered at the corner, crusting like a secret she wanted to keep. Jack touched the top of her head, with the tip of his finger. She closed her eyes like someone going back to a remembered shelter. Her spine was a thin thread under his fingers. It was the kind of weight that makes you count up what you have. He had an old blanket in the closet that hadn't seen daylight since last winter. He had a can of tuna that was not for dinner but that existed in the back of a cupboard like a hopeful mistake. He had in his pocket a subway token he could have sold but never would. He had nothing dignified to give except presents. She came, with them, to the edge of the threshold, and sat on the hard strip of cold concrete that had marked so many of his nights with nothing in particular. She cleaned herself as if to erase the smell of the world. He watched, feeling both an ache and a curious relief, like a bruise being touched and finally acknowledged. He closed the door softly behind him and made a small bed from the blanket and a box he had used to store winter sweaters. He did not think of long-term. He thought of the immediate, the can of tuna, the gentle bowl, the way a bright light at the end of a tunnel would be almost obscene if it came too fast. She ate like she'd been starving forever. Not greedy, but with the urgent, careful concentration of someone remembering how to trust food. The sound of her small jaws was the sound of a machine rebooting. Jack sat across from her on the floor and watched the tiny work of survival. He noticed things about her in that first hour. a tiny nick in the right ear, a faint white scar on the left hind leg, paws that were too large for her legs, the kind of oversized feature that promises eventual cat, not kitten. Each little detail felt like a page lifted from a life story Jack did not yet know. There was a deep, quiet relief in the small ceremony of feeding. It was the sort of moment that, in movies, would map out a point of no return. He told himself he would not be that man. He would feed, dry off, and put the kitten back outside when she was better. He had rules. He had a life. But rules are porous, things when there is a small, wet heartbeat on the rug. He made a bed near his own mattress, not because he planned to keep her. He told himself it was practical. She needed warmth. Practicality can be an elbow into mercy. She slept the kind of sleep that makes you swear you're not in a dream. Small feet tucked, chin on legs, the rise and fall of breathing like a tiny tide. Jack sat there until the kitchen. Timer he did not set went off in his head. He had to go to work. He had to be the man who kept plates spinning at the diner and smiled at people who wanted pie at midnight. He left the window cracked and a bowl full of water and the balcony light on, trifles that felt huge. When he returned, the kitten was curled differently. She had moved her head to the cardboard, and in the faint light he could see a small shape tucked beneath her. A thing like a folded scrap of something. A piece of cloth, maybe, or a torn strip of a grocery bag. She'd been keeping something. He reached in, fingers trembling with idle wonder, and pulled out a tiny scrap of paper, damp and smudged, with the imprint of a blue thumbprint and a few letters that might have been part of a name. He held it between two fingers as if it were a match. It was not much. It was, however, the first sign that she'd been to more than the dumpster. It was a breadcrumb that suggested paths he did not know existed. He read the smear of ink as if it were a map. That small scrap anchored the story to something beyond the one night. It seeded the idea that the kitten, this sickly ginger who had the shy confidence of someone who knew how to hide, had a past that stretched outward. It arrived like a single bird on a wire, a plain object that meant so much because of where it had been found and how she guarded it. When Jack held it, the noise of his apartment seemed magnified. The freezer humming, the distant sound of a taxi, the tick of the clock for hours he could lose. He wrapped the paper in a corner of his shirt and put it on the kitchen table as if that small gesture could keep the trail of this stranger tidy. He did not sleep well. The kitten slept in a way that made the night feel like a thing you could hold. He felt both protective and selfish, which is often the shape of care. Over the next week, the pattern settled into a rhythm. Each morning, on his way to the diner, he would check the little box at the foot of the stairs before harnessing his apron and identity. She would be there most days. Some days she was not. Some days she'd appear with a small offering. A shriveled leaf, a feather, a torn corner of fabric. She left them precisely at the edge of his threshold, as if she'd been taught the ritual of gifting. Sometimes she left nothing at all and stared at the far corner of the alleyway until he felt foolish for existing. He began to notice that certain nights the hallway smelled of bleach and other nights of smoke. The building upstairs played music, through the thin floorboards, and he learned the pattern of that too. The way some families argued with a tenderness that felt like the only practice they had left for intimacy. Jack, for the first time in months, had someone to check on before he went to work. People notice small things when they are lonely. He noticed how the kitten found the exact point in the dark, where the warmth from the heating vent hit the floor. He noticed the way she flinched away from sudden noise, and the way she leaned her head into his palm when he scratched behind the ear. He noticed she never chased the moths inside his kitchen, even when they hovered like a life he once had. She was cautious, selective with her curiosity. He would come home from the diner in a stack of greasy heat and the smell of coffee, and find her asleep in the crosshairs of light that broke through the blinds. She would rouse, blinking, and walk over with the precise, careful steps cats take when deciding whether to involve themselves. Once, when he had been particularly undone, his mother had left a message he had not listened to for months, and it had become a stone in his chest. He had sat on the floor and let himself cry for 5 minutes, exactly 5 minutes. The kitten hopped into his lap without hesitation. She curled in against him, pressing her small head under his chin like an offering. The pressure of her tiny body on his ribs felt like a promise. It was the smallness of these acts that made them feel holy. Not the grand gestures, but the small ones that stack, like coins in a jar. He began to look forward to the ritual of feeding her. He developed a superstition. The extra scoop of tuna in the bowl would ensure she stayed. He began to set out a second bowl of water in the stairwell for the nights she took to the outside. These habits were the architecture of a new life, quiet and unremarked, but permanent as stair treads. Neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Alvarez from downstairs would say, "That little one's always around your place." She said it like a fact. A neighbor across the hall, an English teacher with a habit of lowering his voice as if he were giving grammar to his own life, began to bring cat treats in exchange for stories, short, clipped things about his day. People liked to barter for warmth. Jack did not think of himself as someone who belonged to a community, but small mercies have a way of rearranging the furniture of a life. The kitten, for her part, behaved as if she had accepted the terms but not signed them. She allowed Jack to pet her. She took his hands in that miraculous way animals do, making a claim without words. She would sit on the windowsill and watch the world with that penny-eye focus, tail flicking once in a long interval. Every now and then, she would vanish for a full day and return with the edge of a fabric or a feather caught in her mouth. She never brought anything inside when he was not there. It was like some private life she put on to sleep with, and a different life she dressed in to face the sun. Jack learned to keep a lighter pace around the kitty's absences, to pretend he did not notice the yawning of the apartment in her absence. He would leave a little extra food and a folded corner of blanket. Those nights he felt braver, like a person who had taken up the practice of hope without announcing it. There was the complication of her sickness. She sneezed sometimes, and at night her breath made a soft rattle. Once he tried to clean the crust from her eye, and she recoiled like someone who had been asked to perform a small betrayal, and for a moment Jack wondered if he was the betrayer. He had never been good with the idea of causing pain, which is partly why he worked mornings where his hands could wash themselves of other people's sorrow. He delayed the vet because he feared the price. He delayed because to label would be to own, and ownership frightened him. And yet, as days folded into weeks, ownership crept in as if by weather. He named her. Not because names change the world, but because to call someone is to remember their edges. He called her Penny, because of the color in her eyes, and because of the way finding a penny on the street used to feel like a universe had winked. He suspected, in small, stupid ways, that she believed the same. There were tiny reveals, almost accidental, that kept prickling at the back of him. Penny would sometimes crouch at the edge of the alley, ears pricked, eyes following something invisible, to him. Once, in the fog of an early morning, Jack followed her with a cup of coffee and a stupid hope. She led him up 2 flights of stairs to a landing with a sagging balcony. There, under a rusted pipe, she sniffed and then disappeared into the gap between boxes. He found nothing but a torn grocery bag. He found, too, a sense of disappointment like a child who has been told a story will end with a treasure, and instead finds a note. These little misdirections were part of the rhythm of their life. They were a series of small false alarms that taught him patience. He learned to expect returns without knowing when or how. He learned not to let his heart make itself small in advance. On an ordinary afternoon, not unlike any other, he noticed a new habit. Penny had begun to bring things, not every day but often enough to be noticed. A leaf, a string, a bent bottle cap that reflected the sun in a thin ship of light. She would place them at the threshold, arrange them as if composing a letter. He pretended at first that it was random. But then one night, he woke to a sound, like paper being turned. He found Penny shifting something on the table, a small, deliberate activity. She paused and looked at him like a teacher catching a student mid-experiment. He realized then that whatever she was doing was purposeful. The scrap of paper she had first left under her tummy pooled in his memory like a wet card on a windowsill. When he examined it under the kitchen light, he saw faint letters, a single name blurred into nothingness, part of a street address, an inked heart. It was not enough to be evidence of a life, but it was enough to suggest one, enough to seed that stubborn human tendency to make a story. Something had begun, and neither of them could name it yet. Jack had not set out to be a rescuer. Penny had not set out to alter a life. Yet the two of them, in their small transactions, food, warmth, a blank stare returned with affection, had opened a new map that neither compass nor caution could close. He felt an odd, fierce resolve to follow where it led, not because he knew he could, but because he could not bear the idea of not knowing. The scrap of paper had made a promise, a tiny thing that hinted there was more beyond the alley, beyond the cardboard box, beyond the lit cigarette butts that stained the sidewalk. He lay awake that night thinking of the possibility of the twist. They had not yet met. The idea that Penny was not just a stray kitten, but carried a history like an inheritance, made the air in the room taste different. He slept with one hand resting on the blanket, where she had slept, listening to the night, like it might speak if he asked correctly. The small, insistent seed the paper had planted was enough to push him from mere kindness into an investigation of the heart. It was a quiet beginning. No fanfare, no dramatic doors slamming, just the small accumulation of choices. The decision to fill a bowl twice, the decision to leave the balcony light on, the decision to keep a scrap of paper in a drawer like a talisman. These were the bricks of a story that had not yet earned its ending. They were the first half-breath of something that would, in time, demand the rest. You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The next morning, Penny waited by the cardboard as if she had always known mornings have a shape. Jack closed the door behind him and felt, for the first time in a long while, that there was someone outside his life who was keeping a light on. The world beyond the stairwell was still a mess of pigeons and trash and indifferent faces, but the two of them, in their small hollow, had begun. He started to mark time not by the clock on the diner wall, but by the small returns at his doorstep. Mornings became a sequence of tiny check-ins. The creak of the stair, the smell of the stairwell, old sweat, lemon cleaner someone used too much, a faint hint of tobacco, and then the presence of the little body tucked against the cardboard. Some days Penny would be exactly where he'd left her, as patient as a bookmark waiting for someone to finish a page. Some days she would be gone, and the absence was a peculiar ache, like a missing tooth you could not bite with. Jack learned the rhythm of patience. He learned to leave a little extra to be safe. Tuna was no longer a convenience food for him. It became a ritual. He'd sit on the stoop for a few minutes after feeding her, the day pressing into him from the outside. Truck brakes, the far clatter of a subway, someone laughing at something stupid on the corner. And he would watch her. Watching is a quiet, steady work. It wears a person soft. He found himself watching more than he had expected to, cataloging the small things that made up a life. The tiny tremor in her whiskers when a truck idled, the way she placed one paw over the other like a person folding hands in prayer. Days folded into weeks. The world around them did not change much. The city kept its old habits. The diner remained a humming island of fluorescent light and coffee, where people asked for things like extra sugar and the same pie slice they always ordered. But inside his apartment, and just outside it, a new geography had been drawn. It was not monumental. It was the size of a blanket on the floor, of a stair landing that caught the sun in a particular way, of a box that served as a small altar. This geography had an economy: food for presence, warmth for companionship, silence for trust. Jack noticed how certain small actions made the world feel less sharp. When Penny flopped onto her side and exposed her belly, a risky, eloquent thing, it cut through the static in his head. He learned to respect the vulnerability of that belly. He learned to ask permission with his hands, to wait for the slow, deliberate half-blink that said it was okay. She would sometimes knead with her little paws on the blanket, those blanketing, working presses cats do when the world seems safe enough to make a little nest out of nothing. The kneading was a private work, a ritual she brought into his apartment like a sacrament. It made his chest loosen in a way that surprised him. She had habits that felt like sentences being formed. She would climb the bookshelf and sit on the third rung, where the sun slanted through the narrow window between two buildings, and look out at a slice of sky as if it were a painting worth studying. She liked the window because it offered the city as a slow parade: a woman walking her dog, a delivery cart, the shadow of a pigeon. She would follow the pigeon with her eyes until it became a tiny speck, and the speck moved on. Sometimes she would paw at the glass and then stop, as if deciding she was not actually a creature who could cross glass to chase birds. There were the small, specific things cats do that are like promises kept. The slow blink, which is a cat's kiss. The ear twitch that betrays attention. The exact pause before a purr begins, like someone clearing a throat to speak. Penny had them, in abundance. She had a way of dipping her head just so when he scratched. Behind her ear, a slight lean that burned a line across his ribs. He began to look forward to that lean. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? The question sat in him like a pebble. He would not have said that he needed someone to wait, but he did. Waiting is a form of faith, gentle and stubborn. He noticed the tiny fences in his life, things he told himself he would not cross. He had rules. No pets, no long-term commitments, no extra things to worry about. They were the polite version of armor. But armor is porous. It catches pins and never quite protects you from softness. He found the rules bending. He let Penny into the apartment more often. He left the door ajar when he went to work and felt less like he was abandoning her and more like he was leaving her at home. He took her to the window when the rain started in a fine, steady thread. She sat with her nose to the glass, following the streaks as if they were letters falling. There were nights when she was gone, and he would feel the hollow of the apartment like a missing spine. He would call her name out of habit, quiet as you call someone sleeping in the next room. Sometimes she would come in as if nothing had happened. A delicate thing at her throat, a scrap of paper, or a feather, or the smallest rodent that had clearly been a meal in another life. The gifts embarrassed him. He had not asked for them. He had not even thought of wanting them. But here they were, laid out like a small confession on the mat. He would pick them up and smooth them with his thumb as if that action could translate their meaning. He never grew used to the awkwardness of being given what he did not deserve. Penny had an economy of refugees. She carried things home from somewhere. Sometimes it was a shiny shard of metal, pale and dangerous. Sometimes it was a strip of cloth faded at the edges. She seemed to choose what to bring carefully, as if curating a private museum. Each object had a place on the threshold, a space in her ritual. Jack began to treat those objects like holy relics, setting them aside, lining them along the windowsill until the sill became a strange miniature landscape. They made the apartment feel like a museum of small, private lives. In the mornings, when he had time before the diner, he'd sit with the kitchen light still dim and watch Penny groom. Her tongue rasped like a distant machine. She preened with complete absorption, like someone editing a letter before sending it. He liked the way her jaw moved, the way she worked at the knotted fur behind the shoulder. It felt intimate. The intimacy did not rush. It accumulated. She had odd little rituals in the alley as well. Penny would walk a small, strict path along the brick line, sniffing the cracks as if reading names etched there. She would pause at a particular spot and look over her shoulder like someone waiting to see if you were still following. She sometimes stood at the lip of the dumpster lot and stared into the yawning darkness, as if into a cave where stories nested. Once, on a cold night where the breath from his mouth hung like a small flag, he followed her when she slipped silently, between two parked cars and down a narrow passage behind the bakery. He thought maybe she'd steal something. He thought maybe she'd find a warm place to sleep. Instead, she led him to a narrow courtyard that smelled faintly of yeast and old paper. There, under a sagging awning, sat another cat, larger, ragged, with eyes like old coins. The larger cat did not hiss or growl. It watched Penny with a careful, almost tired focus, like a parent measuring the weather for a child. Penny, for her part, patted over and laid the scrap of cloth at the larger cat's paws. The bigger cat sniffed, then contentedly circled and settled, letting out a rumble that was not quite a purr but close. Jack felt the edges of his chest loosen. He had imagined a solitary life for Penny, an isolated creature bound to his threshold. But there was a network beyond his sight. There were other bodies and faces that inhabited the cracks of the city, making small claims on space and food and the privilege of being known. He had never considered such an ecology. Seeing it made him feel both small and held. There were communities he had not known how to see. Penny's behavior around other cats was tender and precise. She did not fight. She negotiated. She placed gifts and received none, or some, and then moved on with a measured grace. It was as if she was part of an informal exchange, an economy of scraps and quiet courtesies. The city, in its immensity, had 1,000 private markets like this. She navigated them like someone who had been a cartographer in another life. Jack learned to read the subtle shifts in her mood. He could tell by the tilt of her whiskers if she was contemplative or if she was hunting. He could tell by the way she tucked her tail whether she felt safe. She began to allow certain things that once would have been unimaginable. She let him touch the tip of her nose with his fingertip, a small, intimate meeting that made him laugh like a child with a secret. She started to greet him at the sound of his keys, instead of merely appearing when he opened the door. She would brush against his leg in the gentlest, softest way, a touch like a comma in a sentence he had forgotten to finish. There were also her disappearances. They kept him honest. Sometimes she would be gone for 2 nights. Once she was gone for a week. Each absence was its own weather system. He would pace the apartment, and in the middle of his pacing would remember that he had bills, and the life of a man who had set his course, and the absurdity of being so thrown by a tiny cat. He would find himself on the street at odd hours, calling softly into alleys, turning up pockets of light to find her shape. It made him ridiculous. It also made him kind. One rainy night, after a double shift that left him shaky, he came home to find Penny waiting as if it had been minutes. Her fur was speckled gray with rain, and her eyes were wide with an urgency that unspooled the whole of him. She kissed his ankle like an apology, and then, with the small white noise of purring, jumped up and into his lap. She stayed. Not briefly, not for the cautious moment she usually reserved. She laid herself completely across him, head tucked under his chin, paws splayed. She purred until he felt the sound in his bones, a soft, continuous thing that pushed the brittle edges out of his chest. It was a small miracle. He pressed his hand to her side, feeling the tremulous machine of that purr, and let himself be held. He closed his eyes. The world expanded into that small, steady sound. He had not known how much he needed it. Or rather, he thought he had known, intellectually, what comfort might be like, but he had not felt it. The sensation was a balm and a wound at once. It showed him the parts of himself that had been sealed off. In the presence of the tiny creature, his grief felt less like a locked room and more like an attic where things could be sorted. This was the way trust crept in. Not all at once, but in layered acts of bravery from both sides. She trusted him to keep giving. He trusted her to stay. He trusted himself to make a small life larger than he had planned. The breakthrough did not come in a single cinematic moment. It came in a whole chain of small, brave acts. He began to leave the balcony door open at night with the blanket half spread, and in the morning he found her there sitting like a small queen on a pile of washed socks. He began to eat his meals with more presence, because he was sharing them, if only in a way, with someone else. Neighbors started to treat Penny as if she belonged to all of them. Mrs. Alvarez would bring milk in a small carton, and slide it under the door at dawn with a note. For Penny. The English teacher nodded each morning and said, "She seems steadier," which was a way of saying their little community had altered his life too. A teenage boy who delivered packages referred to her as the stoop boss, an affectionate title. The titles multiplied and shortened lives into easier stories. People like to name things. It makes them less terrifying. Jack found himself telling stories about her aloud to people who asked. He would start with small things, how she moved, the way she flicked her tail, and watch as the listener's face softened. Telling is a way of making things real. He would speak of the scrap of paper she had first left, and how he had kept it in a drawer like a relic. He would watch the listener's eyebrows climb, like bridges forming. Even the cook at the diner, a large man with forearms thick from long hours at the stove, paused to listen and said, "You know, Keeper, she chose a good one." It felt like an anointing. There were nights the two of them sat in silence and let the weight of day settle. Silence is not empty when shared. It is a fabric. They were making a small tapestry, Penny would curl in the crook of his knees and sleep, trusting enough to show the softer parts of herself. Once, when the city thundered with the heat of a summer storm, she pressed her small face into his palm and slept through the thunder. The intimacy of that moment altered something like a slow chemical reaction. Jack felt as if some old wound in him had closed a fraction. He started to say her name more often. Names are soft tools we fashion to make rough things gentler. Penny fit the name the way an old sweater fits a shoulder. He would call out across the apartment, "Penny, you little thief," and she would answer with a blink as if to say, "I know." There were practicalities that could no longer be ignored. Her coughing had become more frequent. There was a rattle to her breath that made him nuts with worry some nights. He owed the cat a trip to a vet, he told himself. He delayed at first because money was a stubborn wall. But the thing about the wall was that when someone small crawled into your life, you find ways to climb. He sold a pair of boots he loved. He took a shift extra at the diner. People at work gave him spare change and soup coupons. He felt both humbled and furious that love required ledger entries. But he went. He carried her like a small, angry package of trust to a room that smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. The vet listened, as doctors often do, with a practiced softness. She had an ear infection, and something more complicated in the lungs that would require medicine and patience. The diagnosis sounded like a long word that hooked the breath out of him, but the vet's hands were kind. She prescribed pills and a steady dose of watchfulness. Jack left with a little bag and the feeling of a debt paid that was never about money. It was about the other thing, commitment. Medicines introduced their own choreography. Penny was sneaky about pills. She would take them sometimes, and other times she would spit them out like a spiteful apology. Jack learned tricks. He would hide the pills in tuna. He would soften them in warm broth. He would hold her small body close and whisper nonsense about the weather. She responded not always to the pill, but to the attention. She started to come to him when called, a little more often. The breakthrough was not the full trust yet. It was the admission that she could be held, and that the hand that held her would not harm her. There were growing moments of bravery on both sides. On a cold afternoon, when the building radiator clanked like a tired heart, Penny climbed up into his lap and stayed while he read for the first time in months. He did not read much. He let the letters blur. But the act was small and sacred. She looked up at him, and the look felt like a small confession. "I am choosing you for now. I will be brave." He felt something like a tide coming in. The apartment felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. The real turn came on an evening heavy with humidity, the kind that makes breath feel like a small task. He had been particularly absent that day, staying late to cover for a sick coworker. Running on a fraying ribbon of energy, he came home with the reflection of streetlight in his palms and the smell of burgers still clinging to his clothes. The door opened and he stepped in, a little uncertain, as if he were entering a church. There, on the blanket, he had left half. 1,000 times for her, Penny sat, upright and alert. She walked over without pause. She looked at him, and then, with a decisive gravity, she climbed onto his chest and tucked her small head under his collarbone. She pressed, as if staking a claim. Her tiny heartbeat fluttered against his sternum. Jack breathed with her for a long minute. She was heavy in the best way. He put both hands on her small body, and she did not squirm. She did not try to escape. She beat against his ribs with a trust that felt like a hand extended in the dark. It was not a grand surrender. It was a slow, steady offering. He felt tears come then, not because of the drama of the moment, but because the simple facts of care had become large enough to break him open. He understood in that inch of time that the breakthrough was mutual. She had been given shelter before, but she had chosen to stay. She had been fed, but she had chosen to bring him gifts. She had been healed, but she had chosen to trust him enough to be vulnerable. The walls he had kept up around his heart were small and made of thin things, and they had been worn down by the steady, polite demands of a small creature who asked only for warmth and a place to rest. That night, she slept on his chest until the sun pushed through the blinds and painted the room in stripes. He did not move. He did not want to risk the chance the spell would break. When the phone blinked with a message from his mother, an offer to drop by on Sunday. He read it and then put the phone down. There was room on his velocity for more than one small life. The weight of Penny, the intermittent purr like a machine tuned to kindness, had altered the vector of his plans. He no longer felt the quiet like a weight to be endured. He felt it like a companion. The breakthrough was not the end of complexity. Trust is a living thing. It has seasons. She would still disappear and return. She would still bring odd gifts. She would still demand her boundaries in the most elegant, feline way. But the line was different now. She allowed him in. He allowed himself to be known. Jack started to imagine a future with softer edges. He began to plan small things. A new blanket for the box, a tiny cat bed with soft sides, a calendar with a vet appointment penciled in. He even considered briefly a collar with a tiny bell. Then he remembered how she liked the quiet, and he let himself be content with open doors and warm meals. It was enough for then. At the edge of all these small changes, there was a persistent, gentle wonder about the life Penny hid. The scraps she left, the careful choices she made, suggested a past, a life, a person maybe. He kept the little relics like clues in a case, turning them over with his thumb. He would find himself distracted, imagining where she had learned to pick certain gifts, how she had come to know which doorways were kind and which were sharp. These imaginings took the shape of a map he could not yet draw. On the 15th morning of one quiet week, as the sun cut the dust motes like slashes of light, Penny did something she had never done. She walked into the living room, hopped onto the couch, and, without hesitation, without her usual pause, climbed onto Jack's lap and curled there. She folded herself into a single, satisfied comma, and then, with astonishing generosity, she reached up and placed a small paw on his wrist. He looked down, startled, as if she had stepped into his personal space and left a fingerprint. Her paw was warm. Her touch was tiny, but it felt like a seal. He responded by closing his fingers around it, awkwardly, like someone clasping a hand for the first time. For a beat, the two of them simply existed in the room. The city noise hushed behind, the thin glass. He could feel the small beat of her heart under his palm. He breathed in, exhaled, and realized with a peculiar clarity that everything had changed shape. That small touch, a paw on his wrist, was, in its own way, a full confession. She would stay. She trusted him enough to be still. It was a gentle, simple ending to a sequence of beginnings. He sat there, and the apartment felt, for the first time in a long time, like home. The bricks of the city around him remained indifferent, but inside the room a tiny trust had taken root, and was already, quietly, making roots. Penny slept. Jack listened to the soft music of her breathing. He had no grand answers, only the small, steady accumulation of ordinary care. The breakthrough that had seemed distant weeks ago now sat warm on his chest, a presence he did not plan as much as accept. She had broken her distance. She had let herself be known, and in doing so, she had changed him. The world outside would continue to be a series of small cruelties and large compromises. But Jack carried with him a new fact. Someone, a tiny, scruffy, ginger cat with muddy paws, had chosen him. She had come without a fanfare and stayed without demand. That choice, simple and stubborn, felt like a repair. It made him steady. It made him softer. When he closed his eyes that night, Penny curled across his stomach like a warm pebble. He held her paw with a fingertip and whispered nonsense into the dark. He did not know how the rest of the story would unfold. He did not need to. For now, the world narrowed to the sound of her purr, and the fact that she had finally trusted him enough to break the distance between them. There was a shift that felt like the air changing before a storm. It began small, almost invisible. The sort of thing you notice only after you have learned to look. Jack woke one morning to the clink of something on the windowsill. He thought it was the radiator, or a loose bit of plaster. He blinked, half asleep, and then saw Penny sitting on the sill like a small statue, tail wrapped neat around her paws, and beside her a thing he had not seen before. A bottle cap, flattened, with little scratches that caught the light like tiny maps. He frowned, because the city already gave him too much to think about. He had not expected gifts. He had not expected ritual. He had not expected evidence of a life rolling up to his apartment like confetti left by someone who wanted to be noticed. She watched him while he picked it up. She blinked the way cats do when they are saying, "I have chosen this." He felt the odd, warm prickle of being included in something private. He put the cap in his pocket and went to work with a new, secret attention, like a man who has been handed a key and does not yet know what it unlocks. In the days that followed, the gifts grew more frequent. They were not valuable things. They were small and specific and intimate, as the crumbs left by a bird after a small feast. A threadbare ribbon, half a locket with no chain, a tiny scrap of a child's drawing that smelled faintly of crayons and something floral. He started to collect them on the windowsill. The sill became an altar to small mysteries. Each thing had a story, he imagined. He treated them like artifacts. He turned them over with his thumb, as if reading them might decode a language that Penny already spoke. It was not random, he began to suspect. Penny did not simply bring objects and leave them in a scatter. She placed them. Each object had its own little place, set at the same distance from the threshold, like notes on a staff. There was a geometry to her offerings. He watched her arrange them one night, after he'd come home late and found her in the half-dark, moving pieces with solemn purpose, as if composing a private poem. Penny's movements were precise. She pawed at the ribbon, as if testing its weight. She nudged the locket under the lamp so the metal would gleam. She sat back and observed with the air of a curator. Jack felt silly to be surprised. Cats are sometimes odd that way. But the cadence of it caught at him. Why these objects? Why this arrangement? Who taught her to place things with such intention? He started to notice patterns he couldn't shrug off. The scraps were not just random trash. They bore hints of other places. The paper had a texture like the kind used in old stationery shops. The ribbon smelled of a perfume he could almost place. Something with orange blossoms and a hint of something older, like mothballs in gardens. Once, tucked under a flattened bottle cap, was a tiny ticket stub with half a phone number and the word "garden" printed in block letters. He held it up to the light, squinted, and felt the sudden, silly hopefulness of someone reading tea leaves. "Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest?" He asked the question aloud, to no one. The empty room swallowed the sound and gave it back sweeter. The question buoyed him. It made him think of the moment Penny first came to the door. The way she had slipped into his life with economy and a borrowed courage. Maybe she knew. Maybe she knew the shape of a person who needed to be carried a little. He tried to map her objects against the neighborhood. He traced the ticket stub in his head to the name of a public garden he sometimes passed on his walks but had never entered. He walked there one afternoon, the kind of aimless walk that means you have given up pretending you won't find what you're not yet sure you want. The garden was small, tucked behind office buildings, with a wrought iron gate and a sign that announced, "Quiet hours." It smelled of damp earth and something that might have been roses. He crouched behind a bush and watched for a long minute, ridiculous, like a spy in a story no one else had agreed to write. Penny never showed. She had not come that day. The garden remained an intact little secret. He left the cap in his pocket, and a sinking feeling in his chest. Her disappearances, which had once been tolerable silences, grew in length sometimes without warning. She would be gone for days. He would fret. He would set out food in the stairwell and walk the routes he'd seen her take, calling softly into alleys. Once he found a smear of fur where the wind had been. Once he found a small paw print in a dusted patch behind the bakery. Each time he found a clue, he was quick to assign meaning. He learned too quickly to fill silence with story. Humans do that. We make connections to avoid admitting we cannot know. When she returned, she sometimes looked more worn. Her whiskers would be dusted with grime. She would carry the smell of rain or of someone else's laundry. Once she came back with a slight limp that made him panic for a night he could not think straight. He carried her to the vet, and the vet said it was a small strain. She'd be fine. The relief that made him breathless felt like a new kind of humility. He had never been responsible for another creature in a way that cost him sleep. Now nights were thin with the worry of it. The mystery began to deepen rather than resolve. One morning, Penny left something that made his hands tremble when he reached for it. It was a small square of cloth, the edge embroidered with a pattern of tiny daisies. It had a faint scent of lavender. When he unfolded it, he gasped softly. The cloth bore a single embroidered initial, neat and tidy. E. He did not know an E. He did not know anyone whose scarf would have been left to the city. But the letter shone like an accusation. He started to notice a new habit in Penny. She began to disappear at the same hour each night. It would be the hour after he went to bed, when the city softened and the light in his apartment fell to thin slivers. He would wake to an empty bed and the faint sound of the door settling. He had the odd, shameful, invasive urge to check the hidden places she might go to. Under the stairs, behind the dumpster, to the roofs. But he was a man who had once believed in not making a fuss. He tried to honor the creature's privacy. He tried, and then his worry did what worry does. It grew teeth. One night, he followed her. He told himself he would not. He told himself it would be invasive. He told himself he must trust her. Then he put on a jacket and snuck out, carrying his phone like a weak talisman. Penny slipped between a pair of stacked pallets as if she was already a shadow. He moved after her at a distance, listening for the scrape of paws. He crept through the back alleys of the neighborhood, places he had not walked in years. The city blurred into a softer, secret geography. He felt like a guest in his own map. She led him past the bakery, around the shuttered deli, to a small loading yard behind a row of brick buildings. A single light burned there, a sodium lamp that stained things yellow. Penny paused at the edge of the light and looked back at him, as if to say, "This far. Follow if you must." He hesitated. Then he went on. At the far end of the yard, a chain-link fence separated the alley from a patch of broken pavement and an abandoned lot. There was a narrow gap where someone had once torn the fence. Penny darted through it and slipped into the lot like a secret being told. He climbed over with the gracelessness of a man trying not to announce himself. The lot was small, overgrown with weeds and old furniture. It smelled of mildew and something sweet, like baking long finished. In the center, under a tarp, was a structure, a shed, or a small ruined kiosk, with a door that had been kicked open. Penny disappeared inside. He waited with his hand on the splintered wood and felt the rush of something like fear and joy in the same heat. He slid the door open and stepped into a room that smelled oddly of lavender and dust. It was dim. Shelves lined the walls. There were boxes and, among them, piles of fabric. A small string of Christmas lights blinked with a lazy, understated cheer. It looked like someone had been making a nest. It looked in a way that made his throat close, like an altar to a life. On a rickety table in the corner sat a shoebox. Its lid had been torn back and tucked to one side. Inside the box, carefully folded, were ribbons, a handful of dried daisies, a photograph. The photograph was small, curled at the edges, the light slightly faded. The image showed a young girl, sitting on a porch, hair in a messy braid, laughing. At her feet sat a cat very like Penny, a little heavier maybe, fur-groomed and eyes bright. The girl had an E embroidered on her collar too. Jack felt something in his chest budge, a mechanical thing that might have been his heart reorganizing. He picked up the photograph with a hand that suddenly felt foreign. He held it to the light and studied the background. A stately house stood in the blurred hinterland, a house he might have seen in old movies, a place with white columns and a garden that could be the garden on the ticket stub. There was handwriting on the back of the photograph, little and careful. It read, Evelyn, 2004. Below it, a phone number, partially smudged. He did not know whether to laugh at himself for expecting a treasure chest, or to weep for the sudden, sharp reality of it. Penny watched him from the doorway with that ancient, human-sized look in her eyes, as if she had always known she would lead him there. He set the photograph on the table and knelt in the dust to look at the rest of the boxes. He found a small pile of letters tied with a ribbon, pages yellow with age. He unfolded one and could make out phrases, half a sentence, the kind of sentences people write when they think no one will read them. Went to the market, will be back by dusk. Penny keeps to the porch when it rains. Tell her I love her, from Evelyn. The name landed like a bell. Evelyn, the embroidered E, the garden ticket, the girl's laugh from the photograph. It felt all at once like a story being revealed with the slow patience of a film reel. He had not expected a backstory. He had expected the alley. He had not expected tenderness stitched into fabric and found under a tarp. He took the shoebox outside and sat on an overturned crate. Penny wound around his legs, the same cat who'd been sleeping on his threshold 3 weeks ago. The same creature who had the habit of arranging scraps on his windowsill. She looked tiny and absolute, like a piece of paper that had been folded and then unfolded into a new shape. Jack's head was full of questions that would not stop. Who had Evelyn been? Where was she now? Why had Penny ended up in the dumpster lot? Was Evelyn gone? Did she lose the cat? Or was there a different, darker explanation? A family that had moved and forgotten. A child who had been forced to give up everything. He sat there under the tired lamp and ran his fingertips over an envelope that smelled faintly of lavender. The stoop of the lot felt easier for the discovery, and also harder, because the world had become complicated in the most tender way. He thought of the idea that some lives carry other lives within them, like seeds in a pod. Penny had a map inside her fur, a memory, an attachment, a belonging, and he was only the latest participant in whatever had been unfolding. Days after that night felt like the world had been divided into before and after. The shoebox sat on his windowsill, between the bottle cap and the ribbon, a small kingdom of curiosities. He handled the letters like contraband and read scraps under the light when the apartment felt safe. They were written in loops, the writing of someone who had been taught to make things beautiful. They spoke of simple, domestic things. They mentioned garden parties, a cat with a penchant for kneading the curtains, someone named Evelyn who had a laugh that could split an argument like a seam. Jack tried to call the partial phone number. He sat there, thumb hovering, like a man at the edge of a punchline. The number was smudged. Part of it he could not make out. He dialed the visible part and waited with the ridiculous hopefulness of a child at a mailbox. A recorded voice said the number did not exist. He placed the phone down and felt the slow hollow of defeat. He began to watch Penny differently. He watched the way she took certain steps, the way she paused at particular corners, the particular tilt of her head when she heard a child's laugh. He realized she had been moving through their shared city, like someone following a scent only she could read. Maybe she had been returning to a memory. Maybe she had been made of rooms she could not leave. Maybe her loyalties were layered. Jack's worry turned inward. He asked himself if he could be the person to give Penny a home, or whether he was a temporary caretaker in someone else's narrative. The discovery made his chest tighten. He had been ready to make a life with a cat who seemed to want him. Now he was both thrilled and afraid. It is easier to love something that is a blank slate. It is harder to love something that carries the weight of a whole other life. Then, the objects changed. They were no longer small and innocent. One night, he found at his threshold a length of lace, damp and stained at one corner. It smelled faintly of perfume and smoke. He picked it up, and his skin went cold. The lace was embroidered with a monogram in gold thread. He had seen that thread before. The same exact monogram was on a napkin in one of the old letters. He felt the world tilt. Penny, when she arrived that night, was quieter. She moved like someone who had been traveling a long distance. She did not rub against his shin the way she sometimes did. She sat on the stoop and looked at him as if to say, "I brought this. Do you understand?" He did not. He wanted to. He set the lace on the windowsill and smoothed it out with a thumb shaking with curiosity. The monogram read E.R. in a careful script. Evelyn R. The letters knit themselves together in his mind like two puzzle pieces. He thought of the photograph again. The laughing girl on the porch. He thought of the garden ticket. Of the smell of orange blossom in the ribbon. He found himself inventing maps for Evelyn's life. He imagined wide lawns and a house with white columns. He imagined a child who had loved a cat so much she wrote letters in a looping script no one else would read. But he also imagined the darker options, the family that had left in a hurry, the house that had been sold, the cat that had been lost like a list dropped in a parking lot. He started to search, not with grand gestures because he could not afford them. He used the small tools he had, a camera on his phone, the internet outside working hours, a tenacious curiosity that had previously lived dormant. He took pictures of the photograph and sent them to neighbors, but neighbors are busy. He asked the baker and the delivery boy if anyone knew of a house with white columns. People shrugged. The city is good at forgetting things quickly. Stories get swallowed by the pace of life. Meanwhile, Penny's behavior grew stranger. She began to bring things that suggested she had been to rooms where people had cried. A small paper map, folded and stained. A child's shoelace, embroidered with a tiny star. A crushed theater ticket with the outlines of the numbers still visible. Once, she dragged into the hallway a small metal key tied to a fraying ribbon. The key was the size of a matchbox. It glinted like a secret. He picked it up and felt an excitement so sharp it made him dizzy. The key fit nothing he owned. He held it up to the light and turned it in his hands. He thought of doors in old houses, of trunks and boxes and secrets. He thought of Evelyn who, if alive, might have left a trail like breadcrumbs for someone brave enough to follow. He thought of Penny as a messenger between a past and a present. The rhythm of his worry quickened. He had conversations with himself now, at odd hours. What if he was intruding? What if he was walking into a story that belonged to someone else? What if he was the reason Penny had to carry things between places? These were not the sorts of questions that offered easy answers. They hung like laundry in the wind. One evening, when the sky had the low blue of late spring and the city smelled of hot tar and roasted coffee, Penny took a new habit. She padded into the kitchen, nosed open the cabinet where he kept the shoebox of Evelyn's things, and pulled out, deliberately, the little ribboned letters. She plucked one with her teeth and sat down at the threshold. She dropped the letter at his feet and stared. It was as if she were saying, "Read it. Read where I come from." Jack sat down hard and opened the envelope. His hands shook. Inside, a single page, folded in precise thirds. The handwriting was the same as the photograph caption. It spoke of small domestic things. And then, in a line, halfway down it made his mouth go dry. "If you find Penny, tell her I will come back. I promise. Don't forget the garden, and the key under the third stone by the rose bush. Signed, E." The words were quick, like a note left in a rush. The promise was blunt and terrible and beautiful. Someone had promised to return. Someone had hidden a key. Someone had left a cat alone with instructions like treasure markers. He felt the absurd, bitter grief of being the man who had found the creature between dumpsters and doorways, and now had the weight of a promise in his hands. He looked at Penny and felt a sudden rage at the universe for the ways it allows people and animals to be disrupted. He wanted to write a letter to the person who had left. He wanted to tell Evelyn, if she existed, to come find her cat. He wanted to do everything, and he had almost nothing to offer except the slow work of time. Penny nudged his hand with her head, a small pressure that said, "Do not be afraid." The gesture collapsed him into tenderness. He stroked her slow, like an apology he had been practicing. The cat closed her eyes. The next morning, he rose early with a plan he could afford. He would visit the small public garden again. He would look for a third stone near a rose bush. He would be the idiot who believed in small promises. He would look like someone who might find a world if he was persistent enough. The garden gate was there, the same wrought iron. The place felt different in daylight. It sounded like birds were whispering. He walked slowly along a path lined with pebbles and stopped at a patch of roses, their heads heavy and full. He counted the stones at the base of one particular bed, and there, half hidden and slightly out of place, was a third stone that looked not like the others, darker, like someone had replaced it on purpose. His hands fumbled as he knelt. He dug at the soil with his fingers like a man who had forgotten how to be careful. The ground was loamy and cool. He found nothing at first. He dug deeper. His fingers brushed metal. He pulled up the key. It was the same tiny brass matchbox key Penny had brought. He held it up, and it looked like a promise in his palm. He did not know why his chest threatened to split open. The city, suddenly, had a hinge in it. He brushed dirt off the key and tucked it into his jacket like contraband. He fixed the stone back as gently as he could and sat on a bench to gather himself. He thought of Evelyn's note. He thought of her promise and wondered if she had been somewhere near when she wrote it, if she had left the key herself. He wanted to meet the person who had written those lines, to stand and say, "You promised." He wanted to ask where she had been and why she had left, but he did not know whom he would call. The number on the back of the photograph had failed him. He had no address. He had nothing but a tiny brass key and a felt conviction that things were not as simple as they had seemed. When he returned home, Penny was there, arranged in the small bowl of afternoon sun. She watched him as if she had been waiting the full time of a prayer. He sat and placed the key carefully on the windowsill next to the shoebox. He felt as if he had placed a new star in a familiar sky. That night, Penny did not sleep in her usual spot. She roamed the apartment with an alertness that suggested she had a plan. She pawed at the shoebox and then, with an ungraceful bounce, hopped onto his lap and flattened herself there. He felt the soft rumble of her heartbeat beneath his hand. He held the key between his fingers and felt the pull of the unknown. Then, as if to complicate the small magic even further, she left again. Not the quiet exit of before, slipping out into the alley like a shadow. This time she slipped out as the sound of the door clicked behind her, the sort of sound that means a choice is being made. Jack did not follow immediately. He paced the apartment like a person sitting on a volcano. He told himself to wait, to let her have whatever life belonged to her. He told himself nothing in the world would stop him from following if she did not return. Hours passed like bricks. He tried to sleep and failed. He checked the windowsill. The key caught the moonlight and glanced like a small promise. He finally, after a time of pacing and listless watching of streetlights, decided to follow her. He left slippers by the door, the shoebox under his arm. He went quieter than he had ever gone in his life, as if stealth was an ethic suddenly appropriate. He followed the sliver of her trail, the paws of a paw print dried on a stoop, the smell of lavender faint and drifting. The city at night held its breath. The alleyways were rivers of shadow. He kept his distance. He could see her only when light caught the thin orange of her fur. She led him out past the lot, past the bakery, across streets he had always taken but never with such attention. People moved in sleep and in their small dramas. The city seemed vast and indifferent, and also full of pockets where something private might happen, if you were the kind of person who could see it. They stopped at a brownstone he had walked by, on his way to the diner 100 times. It was older than most, with a stoop that seemed to hold its own stories. On the stoop, a cigarette butt burned out in an ashtray. Someone had left a small plastic figurine, a marker of a child's passage. Penny sat on the top step and waited. Jack's heart pounded like a drum in his ears. He climbed slowly. He did not knock. He could not have explained the reason. The door was unlocked. Inside, the apartment smelled of lemon oil and old paper. It was dark except for a sliver of light coming from the back. Penny darted off the step and into the back room. Jack followed and stopped at the threshold of a small, cluttered living area. It looked as if someone had left mid-conversation. A cup sat by a lamp. A child's backpack lay open, and on a small table, a cluster of pieces that made his breath catch: cards, fabrics, a small hand-sewn pillow with the same daisies he had seen on the cloth. On top of the pile lay a collar. It was not Penny's collar. It was sleeker, embroidered, with a little brass nameplate attached. The nameplate bore a single word, engraved in a careful hand: Evelyn. Jack reached to touch it and stopped. The air in the room had the weight of someone holding their breath. He heard, somewhere beyond the thin tissue of the city, the distant hum of a late bus. Penny circled the table and leapt up, planting her forepaws firmly on the surface as if to show him the items were hers to command. She nosed the collar and then pawed the photograph he had found, pushing it toward the center of the table like a punctuation mark. Jack leaned forward. The photograph, the same one he had found in the shed, sat under his fingers as if it had been waiting for him to notice it again. He picked it up, and then, on a small, easily missed hinge of paper, tucked into the back of the frame, he found a folded note. He unfolded it with the hands of a man suddenly aware that the air around him had shifted. The note held 3 words, blunt and ceremonious in their simplicity. "Call me, Jack." He looked up. Penny sat on the table, ears forward, eyes bright. For a second, he thought he had misread. He had not known anyone named Evelyn, until now the name had become a geography. He had not known anyone who would speak to him. But the note was clear. It had his name. He swallowed hard. The apartment felt suddenly too small and too large at the same time. He felt the pressure of something urgent and tender, like a hand, waiting for an answer. The note smelled faintly of lavender and yesterday's sun. He heard his stomach drop out in the most peculiar way. Penny, unbothered by the tremor in the room, hopped onto his lap and pressed her head into his chest. He felt the tiny, certain beat of her heart under his palm. He looked down at the cat who had been sleeping outside his door 3 weeks ago, at the scraps she had left, at the key he had dug from a garden bed. He looked at the note that, somehow, was addressed to him. The edges of his life, the ones he thought tidy and ordered, had begun to unravel in the most persistent and tender of ways. Then, as if the world were a clockwork toy wound too tight, the lights in the back room flicked on. A figure stood in the doorway, a silhouette at first, then a woman, hair pinned carelessly, thin, with hands that held the exhausted look of someone who had been carrying a long thing alone. Her eyes landed on Jack, and something in them uncoiled. She looked like someone who had been keeping a secret for a very long time, and had finally decided to see what would happen if she told it. She said one sentence, soft as moth wings. "You found her." Jack's heart stumbled, and then dropped. The woman said nothing else for a moment. She watched Penny like someone seeing a piece of their life return. Jack felt every conceivable question surge up. Who was she? Where had she been? Why the note? Why his name? But before he could open his mouth, the woman reached slowly into her pocket and pulled out a small locket. She held it up like a relic and then looked directly at Jack. Her voice was steady, and the words came out like a confession and an apology folded into one. "She belongs to a bigger story," the woman said, than any of us could have guessed. Opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but before the words formed, Penny leapt from his lap and padded over to the woman, rubbing her face against the locket as if reclaiming a right. The woman smiled then. It was a small, haunted smile. She reached out, and without hesitation, picked up the cat and held her close. The room hummed with 1,000 small possibilities. Jack's hands hung in the air. He did not know what was about to be given or taken. He only knew the shape of the moment, a hinge being turned. And then she said, the words precise and inevitable, "We have to talk about where she came from." He stepped forward, because that is what people do when offered a doorway. He stepped toward the woman and the cat and the little pile of evidence on the table. He wanted to ask everything and nothing. He wanted to be asked for nothing at all. He wanted to know if he had a place in whatever this was to become. But before he could speak, before he could place his hands on the photograph, or the key, or the note, Penny shifted in the woman's arms, and something small fell from the collar. It was a thin slip of paper, folded and damp, and when the woman picked it up and opened it, her face drained color and she inhaled sharply. She did not put the paper down. She looked at Jack, and, with a voice that was quieter than the hum of the city, she whispered, "This is why she had to leave." Jack bent closer, as if proximity would allow him to read the handwriting without being told. The paper was creased and old. A single line had been written across it in a hurried hand. The line made his mouth go dry. It read, "If you ever come back, look under the 3rd stone by the rose bush. But if you are reading this, do not—" The sentence broke off there. The rest was gone, torn away. The room felt suddenly like a page, torn from a book. The woman pressed her hand to her mouth. Penny looked from the note to Jack with an old, knowing look. He wanted to ask what the missing words were. He wanted to ask why his name was on a note tucked behind a photograph in a room he had stumbled into like an actor in someone else's play. He wanted answers. He wanted them with the kind of hunger that makes the stomach clench. Instead, the woman looked up and said, "We need to find out why." Penny pushed her head under the woman's chin again, and the sound she made was as ordinary as a purr and as loaded as an entire secret. Jack felt himself at a precipice. The mystery had widened into a cavern. He had followed a cat into an alley and found a photograph and a key and a note. Now he stood in a stranger's living room, and the woman who had said, "You found her," held a locket that smelled of lavender and the past, and Penny sat contentedly in her arms like a returned ambassador. Jack could feel, with the small, sudden clarity of someone who has been startled awake, that nothing about his life would be the same after tonight. He stepped closer. He opened his mouth to say the simplest, truest thing he could think to say. "Who are you?" The woman looked at him and for a long second did not answer. Her eyes were wet but steady. The room waited. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, a cat settled and a key glinted, and a photograph smiled with old sun. The woman's lips moved, and the first words she spoke landed like a small, deliberate blow. "My name is Evelyn," she said. He had expected answers, of course. He had expected a version of the story that fit neatly into the picture he'd been building. In the back of his head. A tidy cause and effect. A lost cat reunited with the person who had loved her. But life had not given him tidy things before. Life preferred edges. Evelyn closed the door behind her and the small apartment took on a new reverence. The sodium light from the yard pooled across the threadbare rug. The shoebox of keepsakes lay open like a small shrine. The locket in Evelyn's hand caught the light and threw back a small, autumnal glow. Penny sat between them as if she had always been the center of the story. She blinked slowly. She rubbed her cheek against Evelyn's wrist, and then, deliberately, with an almost judicial grace, she leaned her head into Jack's palm. That small movement felt like an answer before words. Jack had the odd sensation of being scanned, as if Penny were marking him with an invisible ledger of worth. He held his hand still, and let the cat press her cheek into him. The friction was warm. He felt a sudden soft wash in his chest. Evelyn watched them with an expression Jack could not read at first. Relief, maybe, and something like grief wearing a thin smile. She motioned to the couch, an invitation and a surrender. He sat. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, and of lavender. The same scent that clung to the cloth scrap in the photograph. It had the worn sweetness of things that had been kept for hope. She began, not with sweeping confessions, but with the small particulars that cause a life to reveal itself. How Penny had found her under the stairs of a little row house when Evelyn was 9. How the kitten had fit into her lap like a fistful of warm. Her voice was soft. It moved like someone threading a needle. "There was always Penny," she said. "She came to me on a cold day in November. I remember the sky like a wet sheet. My mother used to say cats choose the person who needs them. I was that person then. Or maybe she chose me because I was loud in a way the house couldn't hold." Jack listened to the cadence of her story the way you listen to rain against a tin roof. Each drop made its own small echo. She spoke of green glass bottles lined on the porch, of a father who left, and an apartment that shrank. She spoke of small domestic miracles. Penny learned the roots of the yard and the cadence of Evelyn's laughter. She slept on the foot of Evelyn's bed. She learned to paw the strings of the radio when a song mattered. Then the story tilted. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the locket. She opened it, and a folded scrap of paper fell to her palm. It was the same paper Jack had seen once before. The same looping writing. Her voice closed like an old wound as she read the words aloud. "I promised her I'd be back," she said. "I promised her I would come home." The room constricted. It felt like the air had taken a step back to give them room. Jack thought of the way Penny had left the scraps on his windowsill. Small, deliberate, like code. He thought of the key and the ticket stub and the shoebox. He thought of the photograph, and the way the sun had half burned the edges. Evelyn's face fell into shadow. She swallowed. She did not try to make a tidy confession. She let the story be messy. "When I was 15, she said, "the house changed. A man moved in. He was patient. He was kind at first in the way storms give you sweet air before they tear the roof off. After him, things were different. I remember one night, the one I still dream about. There were voices. I grabbed Penny because she was all I had that belonged to me. I hid her under the porch because I thought if the door opened, if someone came after me, at least she would be safe. She paused. The silence was a fabric. Jack felt the urge to get up and reach for her hand, to make a bridge. He did not. There was a dignity in the way she contained her memory. He wanted to help her carry it. He wanted to say, "I will." "I left a note," Evelyn continued. "I left a key, and I told myself I would come back in the dark after things were quiet. I tucked the last of my things in a bag, and I walked away. I thought I would come back in a week, a month. I never meant to be gone long enough to let the city eat the edges of a memory." She laughed then, a small brittle sound, and it broke him open. The image of a young girl, running from something that smelled like fear, leaving a cat behind with promises tied to stones. It felt like the kind of violence the world does without. Flair, quietly, and with terrible efficiency. "I tried," she said. "I tried to come back. I tried to find her. I called numbers from old envelopes. I looked at the garden because I thought maybe she would remember the scent of the roses. The notes I left were more for me than anything else, little markers to keep me tethered to a promise. But people move. Houses fall into new hands. Trees get cut down. And then there were years, and things changed how they do." Jack thought he had known loss. He had lost things like jobs and opportunities, and the warmth of a relationship that had cooled into a polite arrangement. But this was different. The loss Evelyn described was a soft, brutal thing, the kind that erases the contours of a life. He felt a churning inside him, a furnace of pity and rage and furious protectiveness. "What happened to you?" he asked, a question that felt both like a key and a trespass. Evelyn's eyes moistened. She looked at Penny, and then at Jack, as if choosing what to tell him. "I got taken, in a way," she said. "Not the dramatic kind, not like in the movies. The system took me in, people who were supposed to help. They put me in places I did not belong, where days were counted and everything was a form. I was shuffled, and then I got trapped in a life I hadn't planned. I tried to find her while they told me what time to wake. Even after I came back, I had a new name from the government and I had a new address that never fit." Her mouth tightened. The room tasted like lemon oil and something older. Evelyn's admission was not a story of villainy with a single antagonist. It was the complicated, bureaucratic kind of cruelty. Jack thought of the dry offices and the thick folders and the people who say, "procedure," as if that explains everything. "I kept making plans," she said. "I would say to myself, next month I will find Penny. I left the notes because paper remembers things better than people. I left the key because I wanted a place to put my hope. But hope is a clumsy thing. It ages." Jack felt the first real shift in the room when she said, "I watched her in the places she was allowed to be when I could come. She would appear and disappear like a ghost. Once I thought I saw her across the street, her fur flashing like a match. I rushed after her and she vanished. It was like a dream where you can almost hold someone, and then your hand passes through them." He realized then why Penny had not been the usual stray, why she knew how to move, and why she carried relics like sacred objects. She had been trained, not by human hands, necessarily, but by a life of tethered memory. To keep pieces of a world safe. Maybe she had been picking things up because Evelyn had left instructions. Maybe she had been a living knot between the world Evelyn lost and the life she had to rebuild. "She was always the one thing I would not let go of," Evelyn whispered. "She was my compass, when everything else had lost its north." Jack felt an urge to ask what responsibility he had to this girl he had met in a cramped living room. He had fed the cat. He had sold his boots to pay for her pills. He had learned to live by the rhythm of a small animal's breath. But suddenly he was in the middle of a map that was older than his good intentions. There was a child who had placed a key under a stone and expected to come back. There was a life that had splintered. Evelyn stood up then and moved to the shelves, where the shoebox sat. She picked up a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon and handed one to Jack. He took it with fingers that felt far away. It smelled of dried lavender and dust. The handwriting was familiar. It was beautiful in the way someone writes when they believe their letters are for only one pair of eyes. "Read it," she said. Jack read the phrases aloud, stumbling over some of the older words. They were letters Evelyn had written to herself, or to the future finder of Penny. There were lines that read like landmarks. Third stone by the rose bush. Key under the sill. If I cannot, then I'm giving you a map. The letters spoke of small details. A song she hummed when she was happy. A scar behind the left knee of a bench in the garden. The way rain smelled in a certain alley. They were maps sewn from memory. As he read, the room folded in on itself. It became clear why Penny had left those specific things at his threshold like breadcrumb poems. She had been carrying Evelyn's geography in her fur, the token of the house, the ribbon from a dress, the cap that looked like something from a child's toy box. The items had not been random. They were a litany. She had been remembering for both of them. Why me? Jack asked. The question was small but full of gravity. Was he the intruder or the instrument here? Evelyn exhaled. Because you kept a door open, she said simply. Because she came to you. She needed a place that would accept her offerings. Somewhere she could leave them without being chased away. That, and because she always knew where to find the human who would listen. Jack felt a strange, bright warmth at the center of his chest. The gratitude of being needed struck him like sunlight. He wanted to say all the right things, about care and the randomness of love. But the simple fact remained. He had acted. He had filled a bowl and made a bed. Evelyn moved closer and sat down opposite him. Her voice changed. It was softer, folded with an exhausted acceptance and the brittle edge of years. When I came back properly, she said, it was like returning to a house of strangers. The woman who lived there now did not know me. The garden had been replanted. People have their lives. I knocked on doors until my knuckles were raw. I left notes under stones. I paid men in the market to ask about a little cat that used to sleep on a porch. It became an obsession. I wake sometimes and still think about that night. I still hear the sound of the boards when I hit her. Annie, that was what I called her then. She was mine. Jack flinched at the old name. Annie, he said. Evelyn nodded. We called her Annie. But the city renames everything, doesn't it? People rename people and places to make the new right. She heard my voice in the alley once and turned toward me, but the people around her scared her away. She is clever. She is loyal. She remembers the stories no one else can. There was a tremor in her hands. She took the locket off and opened it. Inside was a small photograph. A younger Evelyn, hair in a braid, sitting on a porch, laughing. At her feet the cat, a fuller, more groomed cat than Penny's thin shadow now, sat like a proud fat philosopher. Evelyn laid her hand on the picture with the worshipful care of someone touching a saint. Jack found himself crying then, a sudden and surprising release. The grief that filled him had nothing to do with his own loss. It was the human response to the helplessness of another's pain. He felt ashamed to cry for a life he had only just become part of. But ashamedness is a small thing next to the honest ache of the moment. Evelyn reached across and placed her hand briefly over his knuckles. The contact was brief and human and solid. All I wanted, she said, was to find her and tell her I had come back. There was a precarious pause. The room hummed with the mechanics of a city outside, a distant dog, the thump of a subway, a siren that grew and then faded. Penny stretched and yawned, exposing the softness of her belly like a pledge. She looked at Evelyn with a gaze that held a lifetime. Jack thought of the nights he had worried about being alone, of the dull ache of a life that had almost convinced him loneliness was the only thing he would ever need to tend. He thought of the strange trajectory that had led him from pouring coffee to holding a lost girl's life like a fragile cup. He felt something anchor inside him that was not just pity, it was fierce care. Why did she leave those things? He asked, because the question still pressed him. Why bring items if she could just come back to you? Evelyn smiled, a small, almost embarrassed smile. Because sometimes, when people can't see the map, animals remember it for both of them. I used to leave little things with the hope someone would keep them. When I couldn't, she kept them. She kept the pieces of my life like a guardian. She was a shepherd of the things I couldn't carry. Jack felt a sudden, wrenching clarity. The objects, The ribbon, the cap, the ticket stub, the key were not random trash. They were the language Evelyn had composed to make a map out of. Memory. Penny had been speaking that language all along. Each gift was a sentence. The shoebox was a storybook waiting to be read. He understood then, like a truth that had been simmering and finally boiled over. Penny had not been living a stray life because she was without people. She had been living it because she had chosen a roaming stewardship. She had been keeping safe the pieces of someone's past, carrying them across streets and through alleys until a person would open a door and listen. Do animals know when we're at our lowest? The question, which had floated up from his chest earlier months, returned to him like a promise. He looked at Penny and thought, yes, they know. They feel the contours of our small hearts and offer what they can. No one had told him animals were teachers in that way. He had learned the lesson by living it. At that moment, Penny did something that made the room catch. She climbed onto Jack's lap and, with that deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness cats have when they offer themselves, pressed her head into his chest. She stayed there for a long while, her eyes half-lidded like someone in prayer. The gesture, small, intimate, unambiguous, was the sign he had been waiting for. It was a message in fur. I trust you. She was not simply grateful for food. She was acknowledging the work he had done by being present, by keeping a light on. Jack felt as if the cat had stamped him with a seal. The press of her head into his sternum was a small, seismic key turn. He felt his breath hitch and then settle. The act said everything he had needed to know without the cruelty of explanation. Penny had been trying to get someone to follow, to find the house, the stone, the photograph. She had been carrying a home inside her, not because she couldn't create one, but because she had been made of a promise. Evelyn, watching this, let out a soft sound in her throat that might have been a laugh or a sob. She had been walking around the edges of the city for a long time, a ghost of her own making. She reached out and slid one hand under Penny's chin, touching the familiar fur like someone touching an old map. You have been keeping my life for me, she whispered, all this time. Jack understood the scale of the thing then, not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing fact. Penny had been more than a stray. She had been a carrier of memory. She had been a bridge. He felt a fierce, protective heat flood him then, a mix of anger and tenderness. The anger was not pointed at anyone in particular. It was the anger of the witness who sees how care can be ripped away by circumstance and how the smallest of creatures can hold the tenderest of truths. He wanted to fix everything. He wanted to have a tool that would stitch the hole in Evelyn's life. He wanted to put the key in her hand and close the door that had been broken. For years. Evelyn looked up at him, as if reading the storm on his face. You don't have to fix it, she said. No one can fix the years. But maybe we can do this. We can be honest now. We can keep each other. We can share the weight. Her words were simple and radical. They gave him a task that did not require money or remoteness. They asked for presence and courage. For some people, presence is the most difficult currency to spend, because it asks us to remain where pain exists and to share it willingly. Jack set the shoebox between them, and they began to sort. It felt like a ceremony. Each object was taken, up and examined. The key, the ticket stub, the ribbon. Each thing unlocked a memory for Evelyn and stitched a small seam in the space between her past and her present. They laid the photograph on the table and traced the edges with their fingers. They read the letters aloud until the words stopped being solitary things and became a conversation. There was a scene of small rituals that made the room into an altar. Jack brought a bowl of water and set it by the shoebox because he did not know what else to do. Evelyn brewed tea as if the act of making tea could hold sorrow steady. Penny wandered and then settled back into Jack's lap as if to say that the work of remembering could be done on a cat's schedule. At some point, Evelyn told him the last thing that had kept her away. The hinge that had finally closed. Her journey into the place of being able to return. It was not dramatic. It was administrative and tiny and cruel. People who are kind and mean exist in the world of paperwork. She had been misfiled. She had been given an address the wrong side of the county. She had been retrained by systems that made memory into boxes and not people into faces. Slowly, years had passed. Sometimes the human world makes mistakes that feel deliberate. "And why did you come now?" Jack asked. Because the question had to be asked. All of this had coalesced into a moment that felt like the world catching up with an old debt. Evelyn looked at Penny and then at him. And the way she said the next sentence turned the color of the room. "Because she found you," she said. "Because she carried me back to someone who kept a door open. She has been finding me in her way. She put the shoebox in the shed because she knew someone safe might find it. She put the key where she always remembered it. And she walked your streets until someone stopped and listened." The claustrophobic weight of the moment dissolved into something that resembled grace. Jack felt his throat tighten. He had been the person who had stopped and listened. That choice, small and stupid and human, had become a bridge for a life. He reached down and stroked Penny, feeling the little tremor under her hide. She looked at him and then at Evelyn with an unreadable expression. He imagined the cat thinking in the shorthand of animals, about scent and roots and warmth. He pictured all those nights Penny had spent moving through alleys and leaving things at doorsteps like offerings. He saw her as a pilgrim with fur, a creature who believed in keeping faith with memory. "She brought me pieces," Evelyn said, "and they were enough to make me keep coming. The key, the ticket, the ribbon. They were my trail back." Jack felt a fierce, helpless tenderness then. He thought of all the tiny acts that had led to this. The can of tuna, the blanket in the box, the vet's pills. He thought of how human lives sometimes reroute in the presence of an animal's simple insistence. He had not expected that his simple kindness would have such ripples. He had not expected that his life would be altered by a cat's loyalty, and the grief of a woman who had built her life around a promise. They talked late into the night. They made plans that were small at first and then larger, like a house being built brick by careful brick. Evelyn would go to the garden in the morning to look for the bench with the scar on the left knee. Jack would help her call the numbers on the envelopes and search the old phone logs. They would go together to the places Penny had left the objects. They would try, as best they could, to remake the tapestry of a life that had come undone. Penny, who for weeks had been an emissary of a lost home, slept across Jack's lap as though she had finally returned to a secure harbor. Evelyn watched her with tears in her eyes. She reached out and let her hand rest on the cat's head, and the sound she made then was a small, broken sound that might have been a prayer. Jack understood something then, not as a conclusion, but as a lived knowledge. He realized that Penny had been teaching them both the same lesson, that love is not always heroic. Sometimes it is the stubborn act of keeping a light on, of placing a bottle cap on a windowsill, of leaving a note under a stone. Penny's offerings had been tiny, but their accumulation was a map. She had been saying, "Remember me, remember home, remember that someone promised." That was the moment of understanding. It was not a thunderclap. It was more like sunlight hitting a vial of water and refracting into color. It came slowly, then all at once. Jack felt it as if he had been handed a language he had always known but had never dared to speak aloud. Penny's mission had been a work of remembrance, and in bringing Jack into that mission she was not asking to be taken away from anyone. She was asking to be seen for what she had always been, a keeper of promises. He leaned back and let the weight of the realization settle into him. The room felt brighter, and something in Jack had shifted. He had been a man who kept the world at safe distance. And then he had been the man who let a cat on his lap and sold his boots to pay for pills. Now he was someone who could be part of a repair, who could carry a promise forward. He felt the stakes of tenderness like a new instrument hanging about his neck. Evelyn smiled then, and the smile was small and astonished. "She found you because she wanted me to have a life again," she said. "She wanted me to know that someone would keep what I had left." Penny blinked slowly, as if agreeing. She licked one paw and then the other, as if closing a business meeting with a self-grooming ritual. It was the gentlest acceptance. Jack looked at both of them, at the woman who had been searching for years, and the small creature who had been the portal between loss and return. He felt a tenderness so sharp it made him dizzy. He had chased ghosts before. He had pursued nothing as passionately as the small perch of a life on his lap. Then Penny pushed her head into Evelyn's palm. It was an act of intimacy so straightforward it took both Jack's and Evelyn's breath away. The cat pressed her cheek into the woman's hand with the familiarity of a thing that never left. The gesture had the clarity of an answer. The two of them had always belonged to each other. The years had only been a clumsy, human obstacle. Jack watched the gentle reconciliation unfold. The room hummed. The city outside continued its restless life, but here, in this small circle of light and paper, a life was being given back to itself. Jack felt himself witness to something sacred. There was the sudden wild hope that the rest of life might be gentler for their witness. He understood then, in a way that would stay with him. Penny had not only been a lost cat, she had been a guardian of a past. She had been a messenger who carried pieces of Evelyn's life in her mouth and left them like breadcrumbs until someone would notice. She had been trying, with the only tools an animal has, to make sure a promise was kept. That was the revelation. The cat's secret was not a secret at all, but a vocation. She had been telling them, in the only language she had, who she had, belonged to and why the past mattered. Jack felt suddenly very small and very enormous at once. He was small because his knowledge of the world had been limited to the hours of the diner and the square of his apartment. He was enormous because he had a role now in a story that would be told in small, fierce ways. Making calls, finding stones, mending what could be mended. He would be the person on the other side of the door who had answered when a cat scraped at his threshold. He looked at Penny and then at Evelyn. The cat's whiskers shook in a small laugh. Evelyn's face, which had been lined with hard roads and patience, lit with a soft, astonished joy. Jack's hands were empty, but for the weight of the moment. He found himself speaking with a steadiness that surprised him. "She came to the right door," he said. Evelyn nodded. She pulled Penny into her lap as if she could never quite make up for the years. She smelled of lemon and the faint ghost of a childhood song. She said softly, "Thank you." There was a long while where no one spoke. The shoebox lay between them, a small archive of the past. Penny slept across Evelyn's knees, and the rise and fall of her breathing made a small tide against the quiet. Jack felt a tremor of happiness that was not loud. It was a domestic thing, the kind that rearranges a life in small, sensible increments. He understood in that stillness, with perfect, terrible clarity, what the cat had been trying to tell them all along. The days that followed were small and loud at once. They unfolded like a book someone had left open on a porch and then returned. Page by page, nothing exploded into place, nothing was instantly fixed. Instead, the city rearranged itself around a gentle insistence. 2 people and a cat had shown up and claimed care as their work. Jack slept less. In the best way. He woke with the sound of Penny kneading his chest. He went to the diner with a steadier step. The kitchen light felt different. He caught himself humming in the dish pit, a tune that had no words but felt like a promise. He answered Evelyn's calls when she needed a ride. He sat in on the early morning trips to the garden. He sorted the shoebox with her until the creases in the paper looked like chapters instead of ruins. Evelyn moved through the days with something like an awkward brightness. The years had been heavy on her shoulders. She wore them like a coat that needed mending. But there was an unnameable lift in the way she straightened when Penny rubbed against her knees. She started small. She took the key they had found and tried it on obvious things: a rusted locker at the back of the shed, an old trunk at the community center. The key fit nothing at first. They laughed at their own fidgety hopefulness, and that laugh was its own kind of repair. Neighbors became stitches. Mrs. Alvarez arrived one Saturday with a big pot of stew. She put a bowl on Jack's stoop and winked. The English teacher brought an old filing cabinet and asked if Evelyn needed help making copies of the letters. The baker left a note that said, "If you ever need a place to look, my shop keeps its evenings warm." Small offers of human kindness pressed into the hard places like mortar. They also became investigators, in the very human way people become when they want to heal a wound. Evelyn drew maps. She flagged addresses. Jack used his day-off shifts to walk old blocks. They wrote names in the back of a battered notebook. The city that had once swallowed things whole now returned glimpses. A woman at the florist remembered a girl who used to sit on a porch with a laughing mouth and a braid. A delivery man recognized the house in the photograph by a chipped step. A neighbor at the brownstone remembered the sound of a radio. Each small confirmation was a lantern. They found one more thing, by accident and stubbornness both. An elderly man named Mr. Hargreaves, who drank black coffee at the diner and read horoscopes like gospel, remembered an old estate sale years ago. He spoke of a house, white columns, and wide steps that had been sold off in pieces when the owner moved to assisted living. He described the garden and the rose bushes that had been replaced with a bland lawn. He gave them a name. He described a street the two of them had walked past a dozen times without noticing. It felt like being handed a thin thread. They followed the thread. They walked to a sleepy southern side of town, where the houses had been repainted in the practical colors people choose when they are tired. The house in the photograph had been altered. The porch was still there, but its columns were smaller now, and the roses had thinned. A young couple lived there. The woman opened the door when they knocked. She listened, and she had the slow, private astonishment of the person who has been asked to hold something heavy. "I'm so sorry you had trouble," she said. "We bought it years ago. It was a foreclosure thing. We don't know much about the people who used to live here. There was a lockbox they left. We thought it was junk the lawyers left behind." Long explanations followed. The couple combed through old boxes in a gray attic. They found one small trunk. Inside, wrapped in tissue, were trinkets. There was a faded ribbon. There was a photograph that matched the one in the shoebox. There was, beneath a brittle page, a small envelope with a name and an address. The name smudged, the address partial. It was the breathless sort of moment that feels like the universe has bent down to tie your shoe for you. Evelyn read the name, with a small, incredulous sound. It matched a scrawl in the shoebox. The address was incomplete, but it had a county and a year. It was enough. They learned that people move, and that records get lost in the churn. But they also learned this. People also keep things. In a crumbly bank in a part of the county office where the paint never quite dries, a clerk with kind eyes found a file stamped with a year that matched the dates on Evelyn's letters. It had boxes and papers and a thin folder labeled with initials. There was a name inside, and there was a paper trail like a path of footprints retraced. The clerk, whose own life had been small and careful and full of details, offered a cup of office coffee and her time. She helped Evelyn fill forms. She showed her where to ask. Bureaucracy did not become poetry in that room, but people's small mercies did turn paper into a kind of bridge. There were signatures to chase, and an extra step to take. It was tiring, and it was true. Evelyn wept in the clerk's office with a strange, unchained sob that sounded like the years unrolling. Jack sat in a plastic chair and felt the world reorder itself into a softer geometry. He had only known how to care in the narrow ways a person manages at a diner. Now he understood how love asks you to learn new vocab. Paperwork, appointments, patience. There was progress. There was not, however, a single miraculous restoration. There was instead a series of small returns. A former neighbor, tracking down an aunt, answered a call and remembered Evelyn's face. She remembered the girl on the porch. She sent an address. An out-of-state place a relative had moved to years ago. The relative, when called, remembered Evelyn's mother's name. She gave them another number. Evelyn talked on the phone. For hours. She made plans. She planned a trip. On the day she left, the apartment felt like a nest roused. Penny, who had always been more than a cat, sat in the middle of the shoebox like a small goddess. She blinked at them, slow and certain. Evelyn packed a small bag. She folded the letters and wrapped them in a ribbon. She tacked the photograph into the small book she had made, and then she turned to Jack. "I don't expect everything," she said, voice steady but fragile, "but I want to try for the rest. For me. For her." Jack felt his throat thicken. He had feeling that wanted to be grand, declarations and vows. But grandness did not fit this life. They had been making a life out of smaller bones. He squeezed her hand. "You won't be alone," he said. "We'll keep finding the rest. The garden bench, the third stone, the rest of it. We'll call every number. We'll chase every lead." She kissed his cheek, quick and sharp like an oath. She tucked Penny into the crook of her arm and stepped for the door. They walked out together, with neighbors watching and a small pot, of stew in Mrs. Alvarez's hands. The woman who had come to open her porch years ago had returned, and the city hummed like a surprised instrument. Weeks turned into months in the way slow repairs do. Evelyn found the person, a cousin tucked in a town 3 hours away who had thought her lost. There were reunions gentle and messy. She visited the garden bench with Jack, and they found, under the third stone, a small tin box with nothing inside but a moth-eaten ribbon and a note. "I will come back." The note had been rewritten, ink gone soft from hands that had been washed 1,000 times. It was both less and more than she expected. It was everything she needed to see. Penny kept her rituals. She still left small things at the windowsill now and then. But there were new offerings, too. One morning Jack found, not a bottle cap, but a small piece of paper with a child's scrawl. For Evelyn. The handwriting was shaky and a little older than the ones from the shoebox. He understood, in a simple, luminous way, that memory does not vanish when people leave. It migrates, it nests, it becomes the work of strangers who remember. Evelyn did not move back into the old house. The house had moved on. That was a kind of truth neither of them fought. Instead, she took a room in a friendly place near the garden. She found work at a community center teaching kids how to embroider. She taught them how to make a stitch that would hold. She taught them how to sew words into fabric and keep promises in thread. It suited her hands. The work felt like an act of repair, literal and small, a hand, a needle, a knot. Jack changed too. He let life be softer. He learned to ask for help. He started going to the garden, and he planted seeds with a clumsy, careful hand. He began to take shifts that would let him check the house sometimes. He put Penny on his library card. He made space in his small life for new things. He patched the holes in himself with small acts of steadiness. He learned to stay. They became a kind of family, not by a dramatic ceremony, but by the slow accretion of presence. They ate together. They argued over stupid things like whether to water the rosemary and how much sugar was necessary in the coffee. They shared the shoebox. They read each other's letters sometimes, out loud in low voices, as though the room needed to be filled with the air of the past to become truly whole. Penny continued to be the quiet architect of their lives. She would leave at dawn and return at dusk. She would show them little centricities, a statue in the park, the name of a bench, the laugh of a child who had once played in that yard. Her offerings changed, became less about finding and more about giving. Once, in the fringe of a late October day, Jack found on the windowsill not a scrap, but a tiny pressed daisy. It was perfect. It was brittle and small. It looked like a sun mapped into a petal. He touched it and felt the way a door opens when someone gives you something that was never theirs to keep. He put it in a book and kept it like a promise. He felt the shape of his life morph around the gift. The final gift, the one that came when the storm had softened into weather, was unexpected because it was so quiet. One evening, in the last thin hours of summer, Penny left something that both startled and steadied them. It was a small tin, no bigger than a matchbox. Jack found it by the mop bucket when he came home. The tin was clean, and when he pried it, open, there inside was a faded ribbon, knotted carefully, and a small metal circle engraved with a tiny letter. Evelyn saw it and went still. She reached for the tin as if she might break the world if she moved too fast. She opened it. Her fingers hovered above the little metal circle and then took it into her palm. Her hand trembled. "That was Annie's," she said, voice low. "It was on her old collar. We lost it when I left her that night." Jack watched her breathe the word as if it was a new thing she'd been allowed to hold again. Evelyn pressed the tiny metal circle to her lips and then to her chest. The room tilted with the force of the small moment. It felt like the sea drawing back and then letting something golden be revealed on the sand. They sat with the tin between them for a long time. It had become more than an object. It was a sentence. It said, "Promises can be kept, sometimes not by people, but by other living, things that remember the truth of names." It said, "Some things return when the timing is right." It said, "You did not save this by yourself." Jack understood in a way that was more than thought. The world had handed them back a piece that had been missing. It was not the end of difficulties. There would be doctor appointments for Penny. There would be taxes and rent, and the daily work of living. There would be nights when Evelyn would wake with a memory hard and bright. But the pain of those nights was not the same as before. They were now weather to pass through together, not cliffs one must scale alone. Months became seasons. The garden flourished under their hands and the hands of the community. The bench with the scar found a cushion. The third stone was polished and left with a small plaque, placed there by neighbors who had come to know the story. The plaque read simply, "For those who remember." People who passed the bench would read the line and look around, and sometimes they left small tokens, pressed flowers, coins, a folded note. Evelyn wrote more letters, this time with no need to fold them into secret hiding places. She wrote to the cousin who had taken her in for quiet afternoons. She wrote to the clerk at the county office who had handed her the folder. She wrote, too, to Jack in a note that smelled faintly of lemon oil, that read, "Thank you for the door. E." Jack kept that note in his wallet until it thinned into a soft, almost translucent thing. He looked at it when the nights were long. In time, Penny grew less frail. The cough that had once rattled her lessened. A vet, who after the first reluctance had become a friend, gave them medicine and a lecture about long-term care. Jack promised to be there. Evelyn promised to come by when she could. They promised awkwardly, like people who were learning a new language. The cat's presence became a covenant. She no longer carried relics so much. She still left the occasional scrap, but the scraps were now small gifts gathered from a city that had been taught to remember. The shoebox still lived on the windowsill, but it held fewer desperate things and more small celebrations. A wrapper from a child's candy, a theater stub from a show they had all gone to, a leaf pressed that had held the shape of a summer. There was a quiet, ordinary joy to the life they had built. They found humor in the small things. They argued gently about how to make tea. They admired each other's peculiar talents. Jack taught Evelyn to fold towels like the diner did. Evelyn showed Jack how to thread a needle without squinting. Each lesson felt like a stitch. And then, one luminous morning that smelled of cut grass and coffee, they did the thing that made everything feel right. The three of them, Jack, Evelyn, Penny, went to the garden. They sat on the bench that had once been only a carving of memory and now held their names in small ways. Penny leapt onto the bench with practiced grace and settled between them. The sun leaned in. A breeze moved through the roses. Evelyn took out the little tin and opened it. She fastened the tiny metal circle to Penny's new collar with hands steady and kind. The collar was simple, soft leather, quiet in color, with a brass nameplate that read in a small, clear hand, "Annie Penny." It was both a reconciliation and a bridge. They laughed then, because naming is also a kind of ceremony. They watched children play in the distance. They listened to the city fold itself into a kind of afternoon lull. Jack felt the kind of peace reserved for bookends, the sense that something had begun, and also that the middle could be long and gentle and good. They had each come to the bench, carrying their fragments. They left with a shared fabric of life sewn between them. Evelyn squeezed Jack's hand. "Thank you," she said, simple and true. He squeezed back. "Thank you," he echoed. "For what?" "For asking. For remembering. For showing up." Penny rolled onto her back and batted at a passing bumblebee, half asleep and perfectly content. She had done what animals do best when they are allowed. She taught the humans around her how to be alive. The last gift was small, the kind that fits easily in a palm. A child who had watched them for weeks left a single fragile daisy pressed between two coins under the third stone. She had heard the story from her mother. She had come one afternoon and placed the flower with a serious face. The flower, dried and pale, felt like a benediction. The note beside it read, "For keeping promises." Jack pressed the daisy into the pages of a book and closed it. He felt the room of his life full. He had been changed in a tidy, profound way. He had learned how to be present. He had learned that a life offered can return fuller than before. The final image is small, and I think that's why it matters. On a late summer evening, Evelyn sat on the stoop with a warm mug in her hands. Jack opened the screen and leaned his shoulder against the frame. Penny jumped up, landed in Evelyn's lap, and settled there like a small, sovereign being. The three of them watched the sky do its slow, ordinary work. There is a truth tucked into that picture. It is not the kind of truth that makes headlines. It is quieter. It is the sort of truth that, if you let it, will rearrange your nights into something softer. Love does not always look like fireworks. Sometimes love looks like a bowl of tuna left on the threshold. Sometimes it looks like a single key, dug from a garden and kept because someone once promised to come back. Sometimes it is a woman who spends years trying to remember a porch and a man who answers his door when a small, muddy kitten chooses him. Second chances are rarely dramatic. They are the accumulation of decisions, to show up, to listen, to share a blanket. Trust is the small architecture of those decisions. It is a slow thing. It grows in the quiet. It grows when someone keeps the light on. It grows when a cat chooses to knead your chest in the dark and when a neighbor brings stew without asking. And hope is the most stubborn of them all. It moves in tin boxes and ticket stubs in the hands of people who keep looking. Penny never truly stopped being a traveler. She still went out and saw things. She still came back with stories. But she spent more nights curled up in a room that smelled like lemon oil and coffee and old paper. She had two people who would rise at odd hours to check for fever, for cough, for the little tremors of age or fear. She had the shoebox and the garden bench and a nameplate that read both Annie and Penny, the two parts of her stitched into one life. And Jack? He learned to live with the small, luminous fact that saving something does not always mean owning it. Sometimes saving means being the person who listens when a life walks up and drops a ribbon on your steps. It means letting your life tilt to hold something else. It means finding joy in the way a cat will blink at you like a benediction. It means also opening your heart to the gentle, patient work of being someone's home. They did not get a Hollywood ending. There was no neat resolution that erased the years of absence. But there was a rearrangement that felt like mercy. Evelyn found a cousin who remembered. She found employment that mended her hands. Jack found a rhythm that made the morning less heavy. Penny found, finally, 2 steady laps and the certainty of a name. On the bench under the roses, sometimes people stopped and asked their story. Evelyn told it simply. Jack would add details that made people laugh. They never spoke the things they had not forgiven themselves for. They did not have to. Their lives were now an archive of small recoveries. Penny would listen to the conversation, and then, bored, chase a moth. The mundane perfection of it was almost sacred. The final gift, the meaningful one, was not a thing you could tuck into a shoebox. It was a shape that fit over their days like a warm blanket. It was a way of living that taught them to notice. It was the softening of nights into mornings. It was the understanding that the dignity of second chances is not found in dramatic acts, but in steady, ridiculous kindness. They had arrived at a place few stories give room for, a life that kept on, quietly better than it had been. They had been given back a past in pieces and taught how to compose a future from those pieces. Penny, who had carried so much, finally had a place to sleep that she chose because she wanted to, not because she had to. And sometimes, when the sun set gold across the garden and the three of them sat on the bench, people would slow down. They would watch the way Evelyn's fingers smoothed Penny's fur. They would watch Jack sip his coffee and smile at a small private thought. They would see, in that ordinary tableau, the proof that some promises can be kept by strangers, by animals, by sheer human persistence. They would see that kindness, multiplied by small acts, becomes a life. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.